Today's guest is Nick Espinosa, and he is no stranger to the world of technology, specifically cybersecurity. An expert in cybersecurity and network infrastructure, Nick has consulted with clients ranging from small businesses up to the Fortune 100 level for decades. He founded Windy City Networks in 1998 at age 19 and was acquired in 2013. In 2015, Cyber Fanatics, a cybersecurity and cyberwarfare outfit dedicated to designing custom Cyberdefense strategies for medium to enterprise corporations, was launched. An internationally recognized speaker, member of the Forbes Technology Council, a TEDx Speaker, a strategic advisor to humanID, a regular columnist for Forbes, award-winning co-author of a best-selling book, Easy Prey, host of the Deep Dive nationally syndicated radio show, on the board of advisors for Roosevelt University's College of Arts and Sciences, as well as the Center for Cyber and Information Security, the president of the Foundation for Human Internet, and an official spokesperson for the COVID-19 Cyber Threat Coalition. Nick is known as an industry thought leader and sought after for his advice on future of technology and how it will impact everyday businesses and consumers. Welcome, Nick. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to have you get started by telling us a little bit about who you are.
I've always been a nerd. I got my very first computer when I was 5 years old, and yes, I am going that far back. And my dad went to work the next day, and I took it apart with a screwdriver, piece by piece, screw by screw. And when he got home and got done whooping me, I put it back together. Didn't know how to use it, but I put it back together. And at that point, he said, "Hey, we've got something here." So I built my first computer at 7, could program in multiple languages at 9, was getting certifications at 12, and I broke into my first government system at age 14. That's pretty much what started me down this road. And when I got the first computer and I could figure out everything that I wanted to do with it, programming, understanding how it worked, the next thing was, can I have it talk to another computer? Can I move data back and forth? Can I do something between computer and computer? And when I figured that out, the next thing I wanted to figure out is, how do I capture that data? How do I break it? How do I intercept it? How do I defend it? And that's what got me down that road. And so that's essentially the early part of my life. I started my first business out of high school at age 19, and I grew that for 15 years before being acquired. And we were looking for cybersecurity contracts like in the late 90s, early 2000s, when nobody wanted to do anything with cybersecurity or really even realize what it was. But it was so very easy back then to hack into things that we saw the need. And so I was a redheaded stepchild in the room for probably the first 15 years of my life, until the more recent era, the last 5 to 7 years, where everybody's hacking everybody.
Wow.
Here we are.
You were really then one of the early adopters and persons in this world who could actually understand, whoa, hey, this is a thing. This will be a thing. This will be a huge thing.
Yeah, and nobody wanted to buy that thing. Meaning, it's working. It ain't broke. We're not going to fix it. Why should I buy anything else than more than we need? Like when the first unified threat managed firewalls came out, when firewalls actually started detecting threat, we were selling them. Nobody was really buying them because nobody really got it. And now it's just table stakes. So it's been an interesting evolution in the last 20 plus years.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's been a really interesting because frankly, it's really coming around a little bit hot and heavy. It's not only here and it's been here, but it's really in your face and getting worse and worse every year. On that note, so a lot of ways you stepped into this and you were trading from a very young age. This really intrigued you. How do you maintain a sense of how quick the market is changing in that area? Like, how do you go through training? Is there places you go to get your information, or do you take formal training? What does that look like to keep on understanding what's out there?
Yeah, it's a multi-pronged approach. We're always training here. That's pretty much a requirement. I'm always going through, as is everybody else, some kind of certification to make sure that we're keeping things up. Like, interestingly enough, the one that I'm interested in right now is a metaverse security certification, because I figure that's probably going to help in the future when we all have to adopt it and bow down and worship Mark Zuckerberg as our living online god. So I figure that's something that intrigues me. So I'm actually studying to be certified metaverse security professional kind of thing, because we're always training. The other side of that is the evolution of products. One of the biggest problems businesses have out there is complacency, meaning, I've been using the same firewall brand for the last 5-10 years. I know how it works. I know to the penny how much it's going to cost me. That's great and all, but it's been outclassed for the last 3 years, because you haven't been investing in understanding how one company just starts leapfrogging another in terms of capability, technology, threat detection, whatever that is. And so I make it a point to vet every single product we use and recommend every 90 days. I do not publish that list, nor do I say those things publicly, primarily because to sit here and recommend different products builds a roadmap into the clients that I defend, because they're the ones that I'm saying, hey, don't buy a 5-year license for something when, in 6 months from now, we have no idea when that 15-year-old kid is going to break all of Google. Yeah. And now we have to slam on the brakes and figure out what on earth just happened, and your technology is not keeping up. So something that we have to do, we have to maintain vigilance. Complacency in cybersecurity is basically the death knell of this industry.
So clearly there's a deep knowledge here, especially on your part and your company organizations that you're part of. There's a deep knowledge there. So how can the average person, the person who just doesn't care, they just check their Facebook, maybe they're doing something on Instagram, checking Twitter, how can they grasp everything that's actually happening without them even realizing this? Because unless you're really taking time to dig deep, you're not even potentially realizing how quickly this is all moving. How does the average person connect on the cybersecurity realm and keep them updated?
Yeah, and it's funny because my first 2 TED Talks were actually focused on that. My first one was called Trust Sucks. So you know where I'm coming there, yes. Coming from there. And my second one was called The 5 Laws of Cybersecurity. And that was originally an article that I'd written for Forbes. And I had my 80-something-year-old mother in mind when I wrote that, meaning if she could conceptually understand the most computer illiterate person in my life, if she could fundamentally understand the 5 laws of cybersecurity, then as she approaches, let's say, a situation where she's unsure of herself technologically, these laws can kick in and essentially help her out. And so that's actually the one. I'm actually pretty proud of that one. That one's being used in college curriculums right now. Wow. It's being used by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Trinity Challenge, a whole bunch of others as well. So that's the way I approach it. And I think the most important thing to understand, and when you're looking at, let's say, technology or cybersecurity, we have to look at it from the concept of trust. Everybody understands trust, or the lack thereof, depending on the situation. We can see what happens in a society when trust breaks down between 2 political parties, right? Yes. So by virtue of that, if we are approaching our technology and the use of our technology through the lens of trust, meaning we are creating a filter of distrust in the technological environment around us, meaning should I really be using that wireless at Starbucks? Does Prince Ubuntu from Nigeria really need my help with his revolution? Should I be answering that email? If we can have that filter of distrust, it makes us more secure. And what we end up happening is building essentially a global herd immunity for cybersecurity, meaning not to answer the email. I know not to answer the email to secure your social media account, and we're connected as friends. And if you can't get hit, I am less susceptible to getting hit, and vice versa. And so understanding that conceptually, you don't necessarily need to talk about multi-factor authentication or digital rights management or encryption. Those are all things that are important. We have to start conceptually with understanding that we trust technology, even when meaning I can trust that it's telling me the time. I can trust that my GPS is mostly right, unless I'm using Apple Maps. But I can basically look at this and say, okay, is the communication I have with the outside world that's coming in, is this really Nick that's sending me an email, or is it somebody else? Did you just try to change your bank account information on me and say, hey, pay me over here? Well, that doesn't seem right to me. Let me pick up a phone, let me call you, let me establish that trust. And I think that's the best way to approach it. But we can talk about technological solutions as well, if you want to, for the everyday person, because there's a lot out there that people just don't realize.
You're right. I feel like the market is more flooded than it's ever been as far as the different technological solutions. So I feel like that could be a total rabbit hole we could probably spend a whole day down. But to your point of trust, let me just play devil's advocate on the flip side. So this whole idea of trust and distrust, do you think this has any societal ramifications? So for example, part of my job role today is business development. So I'm constantly reaching out. For example, I reached out to you and we got connected. So how do you not create a society that is bent on distrust or bent on saying, hey, everything is viewed through this negative lens? Is it just understanding the situations we're in, or do you think society as a whole will get more negative because of that, or not necessarily?
I think conceptually, trust and distrust are one and the same, but I think it's important to understand how we trust before really answering that. And what I mean by that is you can look at, let's say, somebody that is, and I'm not getting political here, but you can look at somebody that's on the right side of the political spectrum, and they will believe the news that caters to that spectrum. On the same token, you can have somebody that is completely on the left, and they will believe the news that caters to the left. And the reason being is we have confirmation bias. But at its core, we have 2 core concepts of what trust is. And I think that's important to understand. The first one is affective trust. This is our nostalgia, our emotional ties that we have to others through the experiences we've had. And so the example I use in my talk, Trust Sucks, is imagine you walk into that coffee shop you've walked for the 100th time. You've been there 99 times before. Your effective trust, your emotional ties. You walk in and everybody says, Norm, and there's your favorite barista, and your drink is done perfectly, and there's your favorite chair. You feel safe, and therefore you trust. Now, the flip side of that is cognitive trust. This is our logic and experience with the place, meaning you walk into that place on the 100th time and you've never had a problem. The wireless is there. Your credit card's never been ripped off. You've never had a problem financially, meaning they didn't overcharge you or undercharge you. It is what it is, and it is safe. And that is something that we do automatically when we are assessing a person, an organization, an individual, but that is played towards our confirmation bias, meaning if I like, let's say, product A versus product B, and I read an article that says product B is not so good, but there's a whole bunch of evidence that says product A is not so good either, oftentimes we have a tendency to exclude these things. And that's where the critical thinking side of trust comes in, meaning, am I too trusting of this? Meaning, can I basically balance this? We need trust in our lives. You should be able to trust your spouse, your kids to some extent because they lie. To some extent, the institutions in a society that have kept the society running successfully for decades or centuries, depending on the society. And that's something that we're seeing a breakdown of right now, where we've seen basically institutions, while the country is not perfect, the confidence and faith has been eroded to the point where we have a lot of people that distrust society in general. And that's not to say that you're like, oh yes, I love the IRS. Yes. Nobody's saying that. But at the same token, we have to understand that there's a balance that we have to play. What can we and can't we trust? And if everything that you read completely aligns with you, then you're not reading the right things. And that's one of those things that we have to break into. I wake up every morning and I read about 40, 50 different publications from around the world. Most of them are outside of the United States because I want perspectives around the global economy, global technology, cyber threats that I'm waking up to that are affecting my clients in Asia over the night. These are things that I do just as a rote in the mornings. And I'm oftentimes finding news where I'm like, oh, that sucks. I don't agree with that. Yeah. But I read it because it may be right. I might have a bias there that I don't know. And breaking that mold is one of those tough things that we have to really look at in society right now. And it's very difficult when everybody's suiting up in their red and blue jerseys and just basically grabbing megaphones. It's a difficult thing to really address. And technology is one of the core drivers of that. We would not be in this situation if it hadn't been for social media and the free ability to use it, which means anybody can put out anything, which also means misinformation and disinformation from foreign intelligence as well. One of the things we do here is track like extremism and terrorism for specific clients, and you can see it unfold on the dark web and in social media pretty easily.
Wow. Okay, so what you're describing here is cybersecurity is a quote unquote technology issue. Yet what I'm hearing you talk about here is really there's an enormous human element that's at its core.
I would disagree with your assertion that it's technology. So this is something that we see a lot on the IT side where, cybersecurity is the firewall, the antivirus, the whatever you want to call it. Sure. That's data security. That's data security. That is a subset of cybersecurity. If you look at cybersecurity as a whole, the only thing we're doing is understanding, quantifying, and then mitigating risk. Now that can be on the technological side, meaning, you're going to download infections, let's get you that firewall or whatever. It could also be on the administrative side, meaning if I'm turning the Ferrari worth of a cyber defense strategy, the keys to that Ferrari over to a chimpanzee, how far are we going to get? We have to learn how to drive. So it's education, it's understanding risk, it's understanding management and functionality of a business for maturity, meaning are what you're doing, can you manage it? Is it repeatable? Do you have it documented? There's a lot of different aspects to cybersecurity that make it fully functional. But for most people, where they usually start and stop is the data security side, meaning I understand a risk, therefore I'm going to put something in that will protect me from that risk. And that's a very important aspect of cybersecurity, but it's not the be all end all.
That's a really unique perspective too. One of the, at least in this world I live in here in Eastern Pennsylvania, one of the things I see, because my perspective is limited to here, is some of the fastest growing companies in the market, especially as I think about the cybersecurity market, is like this whole idea of end user security awareness training. And that's a big, long term for companies that are basically looking at the human element of it. Is that the solution, or is that only like a piece of the?
So the number one problem we have in cybersecurity, which is law number 3, my 5 laws, is humans trust even when they shouldn't. And that is essentially what gets us into trouble all the time. Now, that could be you trusting that the friend that's actually messaging you on Facebook is actually your friend and not a hijacked account. It's you trusting that Prince Ubuntu from Nigeria isn't emailing you. But that's also trusting the infrastructure, hardware, and software that you choose to put in. Meaning, I trust that the firewall I have is actually going to detect the threat when maybe it's not as good as you think it is. Or I trust the software that I have put in and you don't bother to patch it for a year, right? Knowing that the company has found vulnerabilities, but you trust when you shouldn't. Or it could be even faith in, let's say, an IT team that is not really spending most of their time actually fixing your stuff. They're in the basement playing World of Warcraft all day, just fixing printers when it comes in. And we've seen that when we do audits, where it's like, yeah, your IT team is literally playing World of Warcraft all day long until something comes in. That's why nothing's getting in. And so you never know. But the point is that when you're looking at approaching cybersecurity, even at a personal level, it has to be multifaceted. If we don't train our kids that the wireless can be potentially hijacked and get their devices infected, whether they're on vacation or at the local Starbucks, that's a huge problem. You don't know, how do you know to fix it?
Do you think, because you mentioned it, our kids, do you think the next generation is innately more equipped to handle the cybersecurity issue as a whole, or not necessarily? There's just something wrong with us humans, and it's just something we got to train ourselves over and over again.
So I think they are more than capable of handling it. The problem that we have is that look at the changing concept and landscape of what privacy is today. So you're looking at generations, let's say the younger millennials, the Gen Z, the Zoomers, or whatever they're called. If you look at those generations, they essentially grew up ensconced in technology, meaning social media was always there. Cameras were always there. They probably had some kind of video camera in their room growing up so mom and dad could watch them because it was convenient. You are conditioned at that point to really be okay with that, to understand that. And so the concept of, let's say I'm going through a serious medical something, I'm Gen X. If I'm doing that, there's no way I'm putting that on Facebook. No way in hell that is ever going near Facebook. But I get a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old or even a 25-year-old that's, here is everything in gory details. Let me upload my pictures on top of this so I can get a few likes. Here's my x-rays. And you're giving it to not just you and your friends, you're giving it to Mark Zuckerberg or the Chinese government if it's TikTok. Or these are things that the younger generation is comfortable with because it really doesn't fall under their umbrella of privacy. And either they're going to have a rude awakening when they get older and just realize how much they are data mined in these kinds of things for good and bad. It's not just targeted advertising, but a lot more, as we've recently learned with insurance companies and everything. It's something that I think is going to be a difficult thing to train. And that's one of the problems that we're running into. And it's also, I think, one of the reasons why my industry, cybersecurity, is down 72 to 73 million bodies worldwide per the latest ISC2 report, is because we've trained an entire generation to say, hey, you can develop the next app that will deliver my dog food 10% faster, make $1 billion and change the world. But they're very rarely saying, hey, somebody's got to defend all of this. And now we're starting to see that shift, but it's not nearly where it needs to be yet.
So I got asked this question by one of our customers, and the question was regarding, like, as we think about cybersecurity, the question was posed to me, who's winning? Are we winning or are the bad guys winning? At the time, I wasn't quite sure how to answer that because it was a very vague question, but I was curious if you had any thoughts on that. Like, you talked about us being behind. Or are we behind to the point that it feels like we are actually losing this battle?
In 2017, let me answer it this way, because this is a multifaceted question. A couple of different ways to approach of how you think we're bad, but let me put it this way.
Sure.
In 2017, there was a report that came out that said, collectively, by the end of 2021, meaning 8 months ago or so, we will have spent, you, me, our governments, grandma in Idaho, the mom and pop coffee shop in Mumbai, India, everybody in the world will have collectively spent $1 trillion defending ourselves, whether we're just buying antivirus for grandma or we're getting full-blown EDR systems for corporations and governments and everything in between. But conversely, by the end of 2021, the attackers will have taken over $6 trillion from us, the single largest wealth transfer in history, and they beat that number. We now know that because we're in 2022. They beat that number. Oh yeah, they beat that number. And so if you look at it from a standpoint of simply the financial gains or losses that we collectively as a society have had to basically share the burden with the criminals of the world, the criminals are by far ahead. We are spending to try to keep up. They are innovating and we are responding, meaning it's cat and mouse. You never know when that 15-year-old kid, like I said, is going to break Google, which actually happened in the mid-2000s. A guy named Cosmo, a hacker named Cosmo, 15-year-old kid, broke Google, Apple, Amazon, completely rewrote how we approached identity management and multi-factor authentication, earned the nickname Cosmo the God in the hacker underworld, and is now currently sitting in prison because he was running a group called UKG Nazis, selling credit cards. You can do the math on that. My point being is we never know really when we are going to have that huge change. Ransomware was an evil genius, brilliant innovation in what was extortion attempts on computers at the time, and it continues to get more aggressive. And so by virtue of that, I don't necessarily know if we are completely losing the battle, but in many ways we are behind. And it's in part because as we innovate new defensive solutions and strategies and businesses adopt it, and those are the businesses we don't lose sleep over at night, everybody else isn't. The other thing too that we have is the trickle down effect. You look at like the most expensive Mercedes out there, for $200,000 Mercedes that has every defensive feature, every bell and whistle. It will massage your brain as it floats you down the road. In 10 years, all of that will be in like the Ford Taurus. But what happens with that gap? Like Mercedes had a defensive technology called pre-safe that would sense a crash, tighten your belt, put your seat in an upright position and prepare you for impact. And they were the only ones that had that for years as it trickled down into the $20,000 Ford as opposed to the $200,000 Mercedes. And we have the same problem here. So we have these innovative new companies that are on the bleeding edge, that are able to find, detect, remediate, proactively defend against threat. But the adoption rate is usually only at the enterprise level because those are the companies that say, yeah, I will afford this. Digital rights management is a perfect example of this. Digital rights management was ungodly expensive, and only the top tier Sony movie studios and stuff like that had it, and they got it because they got hacked by North Korea. But my point is that you see these technologies, but the small to mid-sized businesses aren't picking it up, and they're the ones that are overwhelmingly doing most of the. I can walk into a local coffee shop, I can walk into my local hardware store, my local gas station, even though they're part of a bigger chain. Like all of these technologies are not being adopted as fast as they need to be.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, it's something I see in the business world as well. And so I guess one of my final questions for you is, for all the different organizations, businesses out there, they're not Fortune 500 companies. So what can organizations and businesses do without having to unload a lot of cash to get the most expensive $200,000 Mercedes? What can they do today and to fill the gap?
First things first, I think it's important to understand the defensive capabilities and technologies out there. Meaning, sometimes you got to buy the Ferrari, sometimes you got to buy the Ford, or the Mercedes and the Ford, whatever that price point is. And some things you don't want to cheap out on, others you do. So for example, if you buy a laptop that's $150 cheaper than the other laptop, that can be defended in the same manner as the more expensive laptop. But you buy a cheap firewall, now you're doing yourself a disservice. But I think that one of the core things that I would do for any business is, one, start with an assessment. Understand your risk footprint. It's not that expensive to do, but understand essentially the value of your information. I asked the basic question, how many computers can be out for how long until it's so economically unviable for your company? Torches and pitchforks at the CEO's door. If you cannot tell me in hard and soft dollars basically how long you're going to be out in an outage, then how do you know your backups are good? How do you know your defensive technologies are good? How can you actually quantify that what you're getting or being sold is worth your time, your money, and your energy? If you can't understand those things, you have a serious problem on your hands. I think that's one of the first things to understand. The other thing to understand is just essentially the level of defensive technology that you need, meaning you may not store a lot of, let's say, deeply sensitive information. So maybe you don't have to apply a lot of the advanced encryption technologies onto things like databases because you just don't have that information. Or maybe you do and you need it. Understand the value of what you are protecting, because then you can make good strategic choices to that. The other thing I would say is educate everybody that you possibly can. Educating on things like phishing training, all that kind of stuff is dirt cheap to do for any organization. So, you won't spend a lot of money to do that, and incentivize that kind of training, meaning, hey, if you're the employee that spots the phishing emails more than anybody else, at the end of the year, you win $1,000. Now you've incentivized it. All your employees are like, oh my God, I get $1,000 before Christmas. hell yeah, I will look for that phishing email when it randomly comes in. But the other thing too that I would really recommend is, as you're planning to go down the road in cybersecurity or just data security, meaning you're improving your products for defensive technologies, there's a lot of free options out there that you can enable that will make you that much harder to hit. And everything you do adds up to make you more hardened. So for example, if you're running Office 365, as so many businesses are, Microsoft literally gives you a free authenticator with free multi-factor authentication. Turn it on. Yeah. It literally, Microsoft themselves say over 99% of all attackers are successful because the free MFA, multi-factor authentication, isn't turned on. And there's much better solutions out there like identity management systems that track your users' behavior. So they recognize, hey, wait a second, Nick's not in Moscow at 3 a.m. trying to log in, and then they shut you out. That's more advanced. But before you pay for that, before you start looking into that, enable the free defensive technologies. They're out there. They're free to use. And so just understand it's not a be-all, end-all, but it makes you harder to hit. And I think that's something that a lot of people miss.
Yeah, I mean, IT and specifically cybersecurity has become more strategic than ever. It's always been a strategic part of it, but because of the complexity and its speed, it seems like whether businesses have somebody internally or whether they partner with somebody, there needs to be somebody in that organization, somebody with a seat at the table that needs to be strategic. That's what I'm hearing.
I would agree. I also would say one more thing. I think it's important to understand the distinction between IT and cybersecurity. We are trained differently. And what I mean by that is IT and cybersecurity are married at the hip. I love my IT people.
That's right.
You can set your watch to them. The printer breaks, they'll fix it. They keep the lights on. They keep the infrastructure running. I love my IT folk. But it's a different animal. In the same way that like, I would not go to basically like my neurosurgeon for footwork and I wouldn't go to my podiatrist for brain surgery. Two different things. I like to walk and think. I need them both, but understand they are trained differently. And I give this example out usually when I'm talking to like IT crowds to say, if you have never sat down with your people and one of them contemplated calling in a bomb threat to one of your clients to clear the building so you can break in and actually steal things, you're probably not doing cybersecurity. And that was a conversation that was like years ago. And my first thought was, God, that would totally work. And my second thought was, but the cops don't know that we're not terrorists. So we're not going to be calling in a bomb threat.
That's right.
But it's that kind of out of the box thinking of how many ways can I destroy you is essentially what we are planning for and defending against in cybersecurity. So they're different animals. They really are. And I think that's just an important thing to note. So make sure that you've got holistic risk management in cybersecurity. You've got good IT. These are things that are so needed everywhere.
Wow. Yeah, this has been fantastic. I wanted to open up the end here for you for the final word. Is there anything that you're super passionate about, like within cybersecurity, or do you feel would be good to encapsulate this conversation? I just wanted to hand that over to you in case you had any final words.
Yeah, I think a couple of different things, and thank you for that. I appreciate being here too, is first things first, educate. I sit on the board of Bits and Bytes Cybersecurity Education for a very specific reason. And I think it's one of those things that we need to train ourselves. We need to become aware of these things. And part of it is we need to understand how we trust. And I think that gets us into trouble so many times. And we're all guilty of it at some point in our lives. We've all trusted that ex that nobody in their right mind should have ever trusted. We've all trusted that the light will stay yellow when we get that ticket. Like we have moments of trust in our life, but in the technological environment around us, because we are so married to technology, it is so important to understand that how easy it is to hack. In the same way, we shouldn't be believing the hype. Like iPhone people, Mac people, all the time, you drive me up a wall because you're like, oh, I have a Mac, I have an iPhone, it's bulletproof. Like this thing will never, like we break these things all the time. The single largest vulnerability in mobile phone history was on iPhone. And we just found out the VPNs, every VPN is leaking on iPhones and iPads. So come on. So we have to understand these things. I think the other thing to understand too is that, and it also ties in with trust, is that of fake and disinformation out there as well. And a lot of it is put out by people in disinformation, which should be my next TED Talk, is on disinformation, essentially is this, meaning there are people, usually intelligence agencies, that intentionally put out false information, and then meaning people take that disinformation and turn it into misinformation, meaning, oh my God, the sky really is falling. I really have to tell everybody about this. And now I have just turned disinformation into misinformation. And they're like, well, I trust Nick, so I have to tell everybody as well. And that is something that, and it's one of the reasons why I became a strategic advisor originally to humanID and then was appointed president of their foundation, the Foundation for a Human Internet, is to help fight that bot traffic. If we start getting rid of these artificial intelligence-based anonymous accounts on the Twitters and Facebooks of the world, we're going to cut down on that traffic quite a bit, meaning the disinformation will go way down. It's something I'm very passionate about as well. We have to understand that.
I tell you what, some of your work there with the whole government and between the different governments of the world and whatnot, these secret organizations, that is some fascinating conversations. I'm pretty sure we could open up a whole new episode, a whole new series of multiple episodes just on that alone. But on that note, I really want to thank you for coming out. I really appreciate your time. You've been just a trove of information. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I want to thank Nick for joining me, giving incredible insight into cybersecurity and what people and organizations can do today to combat increasing threats in the cyber world. I will leave contact information in the podcast description to follow more of Nick's journey and to keep up to date with the latest in the cybersecurity realm. I will also post my contact information for any feedback regarding this episode. We invite listeners to send in requests for topics on future episodes. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to follow to receive updates. My name is Nick Martin, and you've been listening to the Sound Bites podcast.